Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the Called2B Podcast, where we seek to empower everyday believers to discover and live out their authentic calling in Christ to be a greater blessing in our world today. I'm Reverend Dr. Travis Guzzi. I'm a pastor as well as an ICF certified life and executive coach and a Gallup Strengths coach. And we want to welcome all of our viewing and listening audience to this very exciting podcast. Unfortunately, Kevin Scott and Trish Freshwater could not be in studio, but we have a special guest I'm going to be introducing in just a moment. And our podcast, what we're going to be focusing on today is how can everyday believers make a greater kingdom impact in their neighborhoods and communities. It's really asking the question and trying to answer the question, what does it look like when believers individually and come together collectively seek to pursue the common good in their neighborhoods? Well, as I mentioned, we have a special guest who's going to be joining us today. We have Tony Cook, who is with Lutheran Hour Ministries, who's going to be talking about this topic of how do we, as everyday believers, make a greater blessing in our neighborhoods? And Tony, as we get started to talk about this topic today, I'd love for you to just share a little bit with our listening and viewing audience about who you are and the mission of Lutheran Hour Ministries.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I have been at Lutheran Hour for a little over 6 years now. I spent, prior to that, 10 years in the parish and 10 years working at Concordia Seminary, where I taught practical theology. And my time spent at Lutheran Hour has been originally working on developing material and content based off of research that we do with Barna for North America, but has grown into working with our global footprint. So I'm the vice president of global ministries at Lutheran Hour. And our mission, as many of you might know, is to bring Christ to the nations and the nations to the church. We use a very kind of unique methodology or approach to outreach, where instead of sending people from the United States over to other countries, we empower and lift up and train people in their local areas in order to serve right where God has placed them. So it's a very exciting ministry. 24/7, I just get a focus on gospel outreach and gaining a hearing for the gospel. So it's rather rejuvenating to be able to focus on that one thing and that one thing alone.
Right. Well, thank you very much. And so I know that recently you all have been working with Barna and starting some other initiatives to really look at this idea of how can we pursue the common good to be a greater blessing in our neighborhoods. It really ties well into Luther's teaching on vocation, where in the horizontal plane of life, we live out our calling in Christ that we have by grace through faith vertically. We live that out in the different stations of life to love and serve our neighbors in the church and family and the workplace. But you're really looking at how can we love and serve in the greater society, not just nationally or globally, but right in our local communities. And so you've started the Hopeful Neighborhood Project and some other initiatives looking at this. Tell us a little bit about what led you and Lutheran Hour Ministries to really kind of focus in on this area.
Sure. Well, we started this project with Barna looking at how the gospel intersects the various aspects of our life. So we began by looking at the gospel and its intersection with us as individuals. So what does that mean for our lives, our identity? How do we share our faith? And then we went kind of one circle out from the individual. We went out to the households. So we spent a year studying what does it mean to help develop spiritually vibrant households.
And that's your households of faith, right, that you did?
Yeah, that's correct. Households of faith. So the first one was spiritual conversations. The next one was households of faith. And when you put a bunch of households together, you get a neighborhood. So we just went one more circle out, and we wanted to study the neighborhood. So really what you called it vocation, which is, those are really the realms, if you will, that we work in as Christians. But also we realized that it's kind of first article theology, and that God created us. So the first article, that God is the creator, and he created us as human beings to live in community with one another. He created us with gifts and skills to work together for the common good of humanity. And so taking that concept of vocation, which you've already mentioned, with this realization that regardless of who you are, God has created you and he desires you to work together in community with your fellow creatures. We kind of merge that together and say, well, what would it look like if we ask the question, what is the role of Christians in their neighborhood? How can they make a unique impact? How can they work with people who are Christians, but also just anyone in their neighborhood, as well as how can we help those who don't know that they're creations of God actually live into his will and potential for them in their lives?
Right, right. No, a very exciting kind of focus. Been very inspired by that work that you all have been doing with Barna and the resources you've been producing. For our listening and viewing audience, maybe who aren't as familiar with what you all have been focusing on recently, what are some of the key differences in what you discovered and you're really kind of advocating for believers and groups of believers versus maybe traditionally how individuals and churches have approached seeking to do good and blessing their community? What are some of the distinctives you all have been focusing on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of the things that stand out come from the concept that traditionally congregations look at serving the neighborhood that surrounds their building. So you have your congregation, and when we say let's do something nice for the neighborhood, we really think about the congregational neighborhood, and that's great. That's a great thing to do. However, God has placed each of us in our own vocation as neighbor in our own neighborhoods where our houses are. So I used to be the pastor in suburban Cincinnati at King of Kings at one time. And we would have people that would drive, up to 30 some minutes to come to this congregation. And so while we could work in the neighborhood, really there was no need. We were surrounded by an amusement park, Kings Island, and industrial complexes and restaurants. And so we were kind of in this commercial area. And so for us, it made me think, well, what does neighborhood actually mean? So this thought for me goes all the way back to ministry. And I realized that God hadn't placed us in one neighborhood, but as the church, as the body of Christ, as all the people, he's placed us in dozens of neighborhoods. So I began to wonder, what would it be like if we released God's people to serve right where they sleep, right next door. And then I was given the privilege many years later, working at Lutheran Hour, to actually work with Barna and do some research and study to see what that might look like. So, well, I would say the biggest kind of moment for people when I make this presentation is about halfway through, they'll say, oh, you're talking about where I live, not where the church is.
Right. But see, I think
that's one of the big ones. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a key difference though, because I think a lot of times we tend to think of church as a geographic location, a building, a property, maybe on a corner. And so we think very institutionally rather than thinking of the church being the ecclesia, the assembled people of God who are gathered together in Christ by his promises and love and then sent back out in the community. And so it's much more organic. It's more movement and missional focus of it's being the church wherever you live, work, and play, or as you said, where you sleep, rather than just where we gather, say, on a Sunday morning for worship or a Wednesday night confirmation meeting or Tuesday night committee meeting.
Yeah, exactly. And that is kind of the first big piece. The second piece that really kind of stands out is that this work is based off of an older model, really kind of from the 70s, of community development, which is focused on what's called asset-based community development. And so a lot of times we approach activities in our neighborhoods and our communities from a what is wrong standpoint.
Right.
And so we look around and we say, here's all these problems. How are we going to fix things? How are we going to fix people? How are we going to get people to act like we want them to act? All those kind of things. So kind of going from a broken state. Asset-based doesn't look at what is wrong in a community as its guiding principle. It looks at what is strong in a community. And so really, this approach is a very gifts-based approach where we train people to find the gifts that God has placed in the people in their community, as well as in the infrastructure of their community. It might be libraries or schools or parks, whatever that might be, but to assemble all of the gifts in their minds and ask themselves, if we took these gifts, how could we arrange them in a unique way to pursue the common good? So that leads me to kind of probably another one of the big uniquenesses is you've used the word common good, and I just used it. What does that mean, and why would we care?
Right.
So that's another big thing. I believe biblically that God has designed human community prior, obviously, to the fall and us messing it up, as to be a interdependent community of health and well-being. That we were to live healthy lives, that we were to have emotional well-being, that we were to participate and live faithfully before Him in our everyday life, but also faithfully in service to one another.
Yeah.
So one of the principles that is kind of unique about this, at least as compared to other congregational approaches, is that we truly advocate for the idea that a community is only as healthy as the people who comprise it. And this was a concept that we utilized with congregations. I used to go out and talk to different congregations. I would say a congregation is only as healthy as the families, the households that comprise it. And that seems to make sense on a congregational standpoint.
Right.
But it also makes sense in a neighborhood standpoint. And we know that if you have 10 neighbors and 8 of them are lacking well-being and health, your neighborhood is going to be overall impacted by it.
Yep.
So working toward that living in harmony, blessing one another, serving our neighbor, loving our neighbor, we believe that our goal is to work for the health and well-being of that neighborhood. And that by doing that, we're also impacting the health and well-being of the individual.
Right.
And there's a lot of research actually that plays that out. Right here where I live in St. Louis, there's a street called Delmar. Mm-hmm. And there was an academic study that referred to the Delmar divide. And it showed the difference in one street, living across north of one street versus south, and how that changed the everyday health and well-being of the people. And what we find is that your location, your zip code, in many ways has more influence on your health than your genes do. Mm. And that was huge. So, you might have the same, a twin brother, let's say, who lives in another city, but you might live in a city where there's a lot of pollution, right? So you develop asthma and bronchitis, where your biological twin doesn't. Or say, for example, in St. Louis, if I go 5 blocks, my mortality rate decreases or increases, I guess. Yeah. My longevity decreases based off of crime and violence. So we've realized that we don't live in isolation, but we have been designed to live in community. And so God calls us to use our gifts and the gifts of others so that we might work together to live in a way that He's designed us to live.
Well, it all goes back to God's original intent of His purposes and will, all the way back to creation.
Exactly.
And even though we're in a fall, and even though we see sin and decay and death and drug abuse and crime in all these different places, we're called to be agents of His blessing, of His provision and care. I mean, we just finished up our last podcast on the masks of God. This great mystery, and to me, one of the most exciting aspects of Luther's teaching on vocation is that we're not just supposed to love and serve our neighbor, but we also are conduits through which God loves and serves neighbor. He brings His provision, His blessing and care. And that's not just through the vocations, the callings of Christians, but it's also the areas of responsibilities of people who don't even know Him, that He works in that hidden way to do that. And so what's it look like for us to come together to promote that common good and to be light in darkness with our neighbors in our communities?
That's exactly right. I think that in many ways, while this sounds new and different, it's really just a researched approach to Christian vocation,
Yeah.
and to say, what is my vocation to my neighbor? And that God takes that seriously, and that when Jesus summarizes all of God's will for us as love God and love your neighbor, that he was serious, that he meant that we were to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And so a lot of what we do is really as simple as that. As you said, we're working as the hands and feet of Christ in our communities. Many times we're the only example of the gospel that people see. And as Jim Veltz, a professor of mine, used to say, we are proleptic manifestations of the coming kingdom, meaning that we're like a foretaste today of what it'll be like when God comes and recreates heaven and earth. So my students would always say, we have all these social problems and there's all these things going on. What would we do? And I'd say, well, this is what I do. There's a problem, and you close your eyes and you imagine, what would this be like in the kingdom? So if there's a person who is hungry, you close your eyes and say, if we were in the kingdom right now in the full manifestation of it, what would happen? And the answer is that person wouldn't be hungry. And so while we can't rid ourselves of poverty and hunger, we work toward making our lives look like that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of one approach. I would say the hallmark of this approach is that we start with the gifts that we have in our communities and work our way backwards.
Right. So I want to come back to that. So you've all done some work on this idea of the gifts and passions. Actually, in my dissertation, I actually quoted your Better Together book about the idea of passions. I'd like you maybe just to speak for a second, because passions really can fuel not just individuals, but bring people together in doing the common good.
Yeah, in Better Together, we did research about people who join together with other people to do something positive in their neighborhood. And certain levels of that were focused around people who share a passion gathering together. And it was interesting because when you look at sharing a passion with someone, not only are you benefiting the community that you serve, but you're also kind of deepening and strengthening those passions and those skills. There's a reciprocal nature. So by doing this, not only are we helping others and others are benefiting from it, but we find that the people who are actually serving are benefiting from it in a very, very real way. I believe in America, passions are a weird thing. So I can have a passion about a very kind of ungodly thing, and so while we talk about passions, I also believe that God has given us passions around things that are godly, that are things that are His will. And so to say, hey, there's something that I'm really passionate about doing. How does God intend me to use this in a way that advances His kingdom?
Right.
And it's kind of funny because we have people think through this. So, say, for example, if one of your passions is writing music or, art, something like that, or woodworking. I mean, these are great things that we could just do for ourselves or maybe our hobby, but God gives us these skills and these passions for a purpose. So what would it look like if I use those for His glory and the service of my neighbor? So it's finding those passions and harnessing them towards God's will. Yeah. One of the things I found out of all of this research is that people do what people want to do.
Right.
So if I could tell you how to create a passion in someone, I would be a billionaire, right? Getting people motivated to do something they don't want to do or they're not passionate about is extremely difficult. Yep. But what we find is that when you put us all together as a whole, as a collective of humanity, that we have everything necessary already there.
Yes.
And that there are people who are passionate about the very things that we need. And it's really about unleashing those passions in a direction that's working toward loving our neighbor and the well-being of our community and faithfulness to God.
Yeah. And it's not just the passions, but it's also the gifts that reside in God's people, part of his workmanship and design. So I often talk to people, listen, if you got a bunch of engineers and you've got a lot of welders, you're not going to go start a circus. You're going to go maybe build a bridge or build a house or build a building. Now, if you got a bunch of circus clowns and trapeze artists and stuff, you're not going to go build something. You're going to go start a circus. So the gifting of the individuals, individually and collectively, also comes to bear. And you all have been developing some gifts around that as well.
Exactly. I think it's funny that you bring that up. I had a congregational president one time that told me, Tony, if you have a congregation of lawyers, you have to ask yourself, what is God calling you to litigate? And that was very similar thing. So we believe that the gifts that we have, that while people have them, people don't necessarily recognize them.
Right.
And sometimes you're using gifts that you don't even really think are gifts. They're just things you can do,
Right. But that's because they're so common, or they're so easy to you and so natural that you don't perceive them as gift. But the key is not everybody can do what you can do.
Exactly. And what you find is as you go up the scale of mastering your gift, that gift becomes more transparent to you. So if I were to approach a master piano player and say, wow, I loved what you just did there, their answer would probably be, what was it that I did? When someone asks a skilled person, how did you do that? A lot of times they're just, well, I just do it,
Yep.
But that's not where you start, right? You start with actually thinking about it and working towards it. And then eventually it becomes habitualized, if you will, it becomes natural. So we knew that we needed to help people begin that process. And so as part of this, we developed an inventory to help people get a sense for what their gifts might be. And this was also another kind of thing that people were like, oh, I didn't expect that. A lot of congregations use gift inventories, but there are congregations that use things like spiritual gift inventories or gift inventories that kind of help them understand where they might fit within a congregation and that organization. But what we did is we approached gifts really from a human giftedness standpoint. And so we have 12 areas of giftedness, and we help people figure out where their gifts might be and kind of their top 2 gifts that they have. And we do that with a number of different ways of looking at the gifts and gifts usage. And if people have ever, asked you to use those gifts, or a lot of different ways of getting at that. But then at the end, it prints out this nice little PDF form that shows you your giftedness and where you might find the greatest satisfaction in using those, as well as areas that you might want to explore more in developing your gifts. So we called it the Every Gift Inventory. And that goes along and is used in the Hopeful Neighborhood Project, but actually can be used anywhere. Right now, we're just finishing up another set of resources around our monograph called Gifted for More, which was a monograph that just looked at that inventory. And we're getting ready to release materials that congregations can use to help their people find their giftedness. So you might use it for the neighborhood, as we're talking about today, or you might use it for other reasons, but it's another tool that we developed to help people discover who God has created them to be.
Yeah. One of the things you read throughout the scriptures, these God-given talents are gifts of God's grace. Now, they're maybe not as significant as the gift of salvation that we receive by grace through faith.
That's probably always number one.
But even in 1 Peter, we hear that we've been given these gifts of God's grace, and it's for loving and serving others. It's for glorifying God as we are light in darkness, in seeking the common good and being a greater blessing to others. So, Tony, let me ask you this. So for those who are listening and viewing this podcast today, they've got a sense that they want to go out and make a difference. They sense that they want to be used by God to love and serve their neighbor, maybe in a little bit more of a intentional or significant way than they're currently doing. What kind of advice would you give to them, maybe give to congregations as they seek to live this out in their callings?
I would say two things. The first thing that is normally the hurdle that stops people from actually doing this is that they simply don't know their neighbors and they don't know their neighborhood. And so one of the areas of health and well-being that we teach is relational health and well-being. And people want to jump right to like financial health or something like that.
Right.
But a lot of times I always say, if you want to start small and start with relational well-being. You don't know the gifts of your community unless you know your neighbors.
Yep.
So that's where I tell people to start. Start to get to know your neighbors, get to know your neighborhood, do a neighborhood assessment. We have tools to help you do that, to figure out what all the assets are in your neighborhood. We have some suggestions of activities where you can get to know your neighbors and their giftedness as well. But if you simply get to know your neighbors well, automatically the well-being of your neighborhood increases.
Yeah.
So that's a great place to start. And the second piece that I just mentioned too was to start small. A lot of people do rather large projects eventually, where they're working to, improve a school or start a new business or have a homeless shelter, something like that. But those take time and resources and a group of people who are committed to doing this. So I would say pace yourself, start small, start relationally, and begin to work your way larger and larger. I would also say that at first, it should probably start out with something that is very kind of fellowship oriented in your neighborhood, something very casual in your neighborhood. So if it's a block party or something like that, that would be a good approach. Well, we actually developed this tool. We call them we need things that are low threshold.
Right.
So they're easy for people to step over. And so we created neighborhood bingo so you get some neighbors and you hand out these bingo cards and you kind of see who can fill their bingo card. And each block on the bingo card has a very easy, low barrier thing that you can do. So that would be a way that you could start as well, utilizing one of those tools. But start small. Focus on relationships, focus on getting to know the gifts of your neighborhood and the gifts of your neighbors. And as you grow and get to know each other, it'll emerge. You'll say, hey, I know that you can do this. What if we put your skill and my skill together and we did this thing for the neighborhood?
Right.
But you can't do that if you don't know your neighbors.
Yeah.
And you'll hear a lot of people, they'll say, wow, I love this program, but I don't know my neighbors. Or I love this program, but I don't like my neighbors. My neighbors don't cut their grass or, whatever it is. And I'm like, well, that's a good place to start probably.
Right. Yeah, maybe there's a reason they're not mowing their grass, and maybe getting to know them, you might find out what that is. So
exactly. So get to know your neighbors, start small, start relationally. And as always, because this is an asset-based approach, start positively, celebrate your people in your neighborhood, your neighbors, and celebrate your neighborhood. And the more you celebrate what God has placed in those communities, the more people will be willing to share their passions to see that neighborhood grow.
Yeah, and a lot of work I do with congregations, I use an appreciative inquiry approach. And so instead of coming into congregations and saying what's wrong and how do we fix it, it's asking the questions. That's appreciative inquiry, asking questions about what's right, and then how do we build on it? And it sounds like a very similar kind of mindset and approach when we seek to do the common good and be a greater blessing in our communities. Going in, not what's wrong, how do we fix it, what's right, and how can we build on it, bring it together to be the blessing God intends.
Tony, that's exactly right.
Yeah. Tony, let me ask you this. So maybe those who are listening and viewing, you mentioned a number of different resources here. Maybe just give you a chance for a plug for Lutheran Hour and some of the resources. What are those? And then how can individuals get a hold of you to find out more about this work that you all are doing?
Sure. Well, if you're interested in our Hopeful Neighborhood program, which is our program focused on improving well-being, you can visit hopefulneighborhood.org. That's where our website is. And you can actually message us. You can talk to us. You can sign up. You can email us. You can get our emails can be sent that will give ideas, stories. We got kind of great blogs to inspire you. We can coach you, help you do stuff if you want. So if you're interested in that, that would be hopefulneighborhood.org. If you're interested in our research on Better Together that you referred to, you can go to lhm.org/together. lhm.org/together. And if you're interested in our giftedness survey, you can go to lhm.org/gifted. And there you'll find information about the Every Gift survey. That's completely free. It doesn't cost you anything. If you call us, we can help you run your whole congregation through it if you want, or just the people in your neighborhood if you like. But those would be three ways of doing it. You can always just contact me at Lutheran Hour if you like. So Tony.Cook at lhm.org, and I'll talk to you too, and get you connected with one of our great team members to help you out.
That's fantastic. Tony, thank you so much for joining us for the Called2B podcast. Very much appreciate you and the resources that you all have with Lutheran Hour Ministry, and especially on this, how can we bless our neighborhoods? How can we bless our communities and make them better and be conduits of God's grace and mercy? Well, we want to thank our listening and viewing audience for joining us for this Called2B podcast on impacting your neighborhood. Special thanks to Tony and Lutheran Hour Ministries. They've got some fantastic resources, so make sure that you check them out, especially their Hopeful Neighborhood project. But perhaps you're struggling and you're just, what does this mean for me personally and practically? Well, here's the good news. You don't have to do that alone. I'd just like to encourage you that if you would like a creative think partner to walk along with you, reach out to me. I'd love to start a coaching conversation and just help you translate all this great knowledge and resources for who you are, your passions, your gifts, and where God has called you, your context of where you live, work, and play. Another call to action is this. If you have been blessed by this podcast, not only listen and view, but also like and share it with others, that maybe it might be a blessing to them as well. We also want to thank the Southeastern District in Mainland for their generous gifts that made this podcast possible. And with that, we want to wish you all God's richest blessings. I will catch you next time for the Called2B podcast. Take care, everybody.